guys, it's Kelly. First of all, thanks so much for listening. Time is our most valuable resource, and it means a lot that you choose to spend some of your time going down this rabbit hole with me. If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to help it grow, one of the best things you can do is to subscribe and write a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to take it a step further, you can also join the Patreon at patreon.com/UFO rabbit hole. And to make sure you never miss an episode and stay up to date on the latest news, you can subscribe to the email list at uforabbithole.com. And don't forget to connect with the show on social media as well. I'd love to connect with you guys. All the links are in the episode notes. All right, that's enough housekeeping for now. Let's get to the show. Welcome back to the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Chase. Today we return with part 2 of Mr. DeLong Goes to Washington. If you haven't heard part 1, you'll want to go back to the previous episode to get caught up, or much of what follows won't make a lot of sense. So, let's dive right in. When we last saw our hero, Tom DeLonge, he was basking in the glow of a seemingly impossible victory, not only proving that his shadowy advisors within the government were real, but leveraging those relationships to do something that no one has ever been able to do before: force the Pentagon to admit that UFOs are real. So, what's going on with Tom DeLonge and his illustrious colleagues at the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences now? Did they accomplish their mission? That depends on who you ask. On the one hand, since TTSA's formation in 2017, the organization has succeeded more spectacularly in the disclosure effort than anyone ever has before. And in the history books, they alone will have the distinction of being the ones that forced the Pentagon to admit that the UFO phenomenon was real. The importance and impact of that one accomplishment really can't be overstated, and the impact is still being felt. However, I think that the public's reaction to these events, or more accurately, the public's lack of reaction, was as surprising to the members of TTSA as it was to anyone else who was actually paying attention. There was the press conference, the New York Times article, the declassified videos, an actual admission from the Pentagon, and a report handed over to Congress that admittedly didn't say much, but what it did say was earth-shattering, that UFOs are both real and not human technology. But somehow, the Earth wasn't shattered. These were B stories in the 24-hour outrage cycle of the news media that was, at the time, deliriously glutted with the chaos of the pandemic and the election, breathlessly analyzing and pontificating on each and every one of the president's tweets. The revolution was here, the end was nigh, and all of it, apparently, was going to be televised. A few weeks before I started this podcast, I started to ask my friends and family a question. What would it take for you to take the UFO issue seriously? I wasn't trying to change anyone's mind or to tell them what I believed. I just listened to what they had to say. And of those I talked to, most of them said some version of the same thing, which is summed up well by this comment from someone I know. Quote, "I guess it depends on what you mean by UFOs. There are certainly things flying around that we can't immediately identify. If you're talking about the idea of beings from off the planet coming to visit, I guess as long as they choose to do it clandestinely, we will never know. Beings with sufficient technology to get here probably have sufficient technology to hide from us. If that's so, there's really no effect on my life or anyone else's. If a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, etc. If they decide to reveal themselves, it really won't be a question anymore, and the potential result is completely unpredictable. In the end, there is really nothing actionable regarding the question, so it's hard for me to take it seriously," end quote. I suspect that this is how most people think, and as a result, disclosure of the existence of UFOs, though undeniably monumental, had little to no impact on the public consciousness. It's becoming clear that disclosure won't be a singular event, but a much longer and more complicated process that will unfold over time. Whether there ever is that earth-shattering event that suddenly snaps the public consciousness into focus on this topic remains to be seen, but it certainly feels farther off than it did when TTSA took to the stage for the first time. And TTSA itself has changed in both shape and substance in the years since. In December 2020, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, and Steve Justice left TTSA, though Jim Semivan and Hal Puthoff still remain part of the team. Still, many perceived this exit as almost an admission of defeat for the organization, or at the very least, for DeLonge himself. For his part, Tom DeLonge says that this changeup was caused partly due to the impact of COVID on his ability to attract investors to his, admittedly, high-risk projects. And in February 2021, papers were filed with the SEC indicating that TTSA would be abandoning its science and technology initiatives and focusing solely on the entertainment division. The split seemed to be amicable, at least, and there appears to be no bad blood among the original team members. In an interview with George Knapp on Coast to Coast shortly after the split, Lou Elizondo said, "I love my friends at TTSA. They are incredible human beings. But I also have to say, my mission has always been very clear, and that was to push disclosure forward. That's it. I think after 3 years, I can look back and I think we've achieved much of what we've set out to do. TTSA, it's no secret, also focuses on its entertainment division, and let's face it, guys like Chris Mellon and Steve Justice and myself, we're not entertainers. So, very much like the History Channel project, we have accomplished our mission. Mission success. We have done more in 3 years collectively than anybody I think really expected us to achieve," end quote. And I agree. I think the only real fault that you can assign to TTSA and what they've managed to accomplish is just that they didn't manage to accomplish all of the things that they set out to accomplish. But I also think that that bar is too high to really be a fair one. The original scope and substance of the TTSA mission was sweeping to the point of being grandiose. Among the many TTSA projects touted by DeLonge was an effort to reverse engineer a UFO from recovered crash materials that he claimed to have in his possession. And honestly, that just makes me smile, because who would attempt such a thing? And of the people who would attempt it, who would say it aloud, knowing that they could still fail? Tom DeLonge, that's who. And though his reach may have, thus far, exceeded his grasp, if it weren't for the absurd grandiosity of his vision and his dogged, inexhaustible pursuit of it, none of this ever would have happened. He may not be batting 1,000, but anyone who would take a bet against Tom DeLonge accomplishing whatever he puts his mind to simply hasn't been paying attention. So, given all that we've just discussed, you would think that Tom DeLonge would be the undisputed hero of the UFO community. On the back of good old-fashioned hard work and shoe leather, he somehow managed to penetrate the shadowy upper echelons of the United States military and intelligence apparatus, earning not just the support, but the apparent trust of some incredibly important people. He assembled what can only be described as the Avengers of UFO disclosure, who together managed to force Congress, the mainstream media, and the public at large to at least begin to recognize the reality of the UFO phenomenon and begin to reckon with the enormity of the challenge that lies ahead. And finally, as if that wasn't enough, his work directly led to the first ever declassified videos of UFOs being released and acknowledged to the public, along with the long-awaited admission that these craft are real. And yet, the reality is that Tom DeLonge remains a controversial figure within the UFO community. So what gives? I think that there are a few different reasons that this is the case. The first is that some people are concerned about having Tom DeLonge as the face of the UFO disclosure movement because they don't think that he always presents the community in the best light. And having spent decades fighting against stigma and ridicule, many in the community believe that we need to be putting forward leaders who are serious, credible, and credentialed in order to bring more legitimacy to the topic. And the reality is that, despite being a wildly successful musician, singer, songwriter, author, record producer, actor, filmmaker, and serial entrepreneur, The image of DeLonge and his bandmates streaking naked through the streets in the video for What's My Age Again has been hard for Tom to shake, much to his chagrin. And to be frank, despite DeLonge's obvious desire to be taken seriously for his artistic, entrepreneurial, and even scholarly pursuits, he often hasn't done himself any favors in this department. He's seemingly never lost the conviction that he's held since childhood, that he could make his own way while being unapologetically himself. Though clearly brilliant and staggeringly well-read, in interviews, DeLonge can sometimes come across as scattered, careening brazenly from one shocking statement to the next in a manner that can somehow come across as both overly casual and grandiose. It can be hard to know what to make of him, especially when the things that he says sound so entirely outrageous and over the top in their fantastic and conspiratorial nature that even among the UFO community, there are certain segments that still believe him to be entirely unhinged. And that's really saying something. The fact that he's as likely to hit you with a dick joke as he is with the details of quantum mechanics or advanced propulsion systems doesn't really help matters. The second reason for DeLonge's controversial status within the UFO community boils down to jealousy, or at least something adjacent to it. For those of us who believe that the study of the UFO phenomenon has the potential to unlock a new phase of human evolution, and I say us because I count myself among them, it can be hard to separate your desire to move disclosure forward from an all-too-human desire to be somehow important in doing so. It's the very essence of what it means to be human, to search for meaning and purpose in our lives. And what could be more meaningful than playing a role in humankind awakening to the reality that we are not alone, and perhaps never have been? It has all the makings not just of future history, but of legend. It can be hard not to want to cast yourself in a leading role in a story like that. It's also important to recognize that there have been so many members of the UFO community who have toiled in obscurity for years, if not decades, silenced, ridiculed, and ignored, who took on the Herculean and entirely thankless task of carrying the torch for this movement long before the Pentagon's recent admission on the reality of the UFO phenomenon made the subject at least somewhat palatable for the mainstream media or the public at large. And I think it can be tough for some people to have this cocky, literal rock star who looks and often acts like the skater dude in high school who would sell you drugs and then steal your girlfriend, come in and become not just the face of, but perhaps one of the most important figures ever in the disclosure movement. Obviously, this perspective fails to give DeLonge the credit that he is due for imagining and then pulling off the impossible. But it's not hard to understand how people end up there, or to have compassion for their stance, unfair as it may be. The third reason that many in the UFO community are suspicious of DeLonge is that his work with UFOs is deeply tied to his business ventures. DeLonge's vision for his role in the future of UFO disclosure involves a multimedia empire, books, albums, movie franchises, merchandise, and more. And for many, this alone is enough cause to question his motivations. Within the UFO community, there is a near ubiquitous suspicion of people who have monetized their work within the movement. And for good reason. As I'm sure you can imagine, there are plenty of charlatans and hucksters in the UFO world who exploit the unquestioning belief of some of the more vulnerable members of the community, claiming special knowledge and often the ability to facilitate contact between their followers and extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings. Too often, it starts innocently enough, selling books and training courses, maybe making a documentary or two, but somewhere along the way, the whole thing just takes a sharp left turn into cult territory. And suddenly, they aren't just a researcher, but some kind of messiah, destined to usher in a new age of human evolution as we take our rightful seat as children of the cosmos, or whatever. It doesn't help that DeLonge has at times aligned himself with some of these figures, including Dr. Stephen Greer. Yes, the same Dr. Stephen Greer with whom it is speculated that DeLonge had his first encounter that caused him to quit Blink-182 to pursue disclosure full-time. Although Greer was the driving force behind the notable but ultimately unsuccessful disclosure project of the early 2000s, he has earned criticism over the years for monetizing his CE5 techniques. For years, Greer has charged would-be experiencers for CE5 sessions in remote areas where they attempt to make contact with UFOs. He also offers training for people to become ambassadors who are then licensed to go teach CE5 on their own. Not only has Greer been persistently dogged by rumors that he fakes UFO encounters during his CE5 sessions, which happen almost exclusively at night using flares, but his business model has often been compared to multi-level marketing, aka a pyramid scheme. Greer has not done himself any favors in the credibility department, making increasingly bizarre claims, including that he was offered $2 billion by the government to stop talking about UFOs, which he allegedly refused. He's also come out strongly against TTSA, citing the counterintelligence backgrounds of several of its members, including Lou Elizondo, and claiming that the work that they're doing is a disinformation campaign that is likely a lead-up to a staged alien invasion. Anyway, I bring this all up as a side note because I think all of this could explain why DeLonge hasn't said that Dr. Greer is the ufologist with whom he had his first encounter with the phenomenon, even though it's fairly clear that it could be almost no one else. Possibly because of Greer's deteriorating reputation, and even more likely because of Greer's objections to his methods and the company that he keeps. But there's one more interesting possibility, which is that if it's true that Dr. Stephen Greer does, in fact, fake UFO encounters for both clout and cash, wouldn't he be highly motivated to produce results for someone like Tom DeLonge? You have to wonder if part of the reason that DeLonge doesn't say his name is because it calls that whole story into question. Did he really have an otherworldly experience out there in the desert, or was he the victim of a seasoned con man? To be honest, it truly doesn't matter either way. None of that can diminish the importance or impact of the work that followed, nor does that one individual experience have any bearing on whether or not the phenomenon itself is real. But it is interesting to think about. Anyway, although there are plenty of people in the UFO community who aren't afraid to stretch or even completely manufacture the truth in order to make a buck, with an estimated net worth of $70 million, it seems unlikely that that's Tom DeLonge's motivation. And when you're talking about funding everything from major motion picture franchises to reverse engineering exotic materials from UFO crash sites, it's possible, and even likely, that DeLonge has sunk more money into this project than he's ever taken out of it. Another reason that some are suspicious of Tom DeLonge is because they don't understand why, of all the people in the world, he was chosen to be the person to receive access to privileged information and allowed to be the face of what looks to be a sincere effort to pursue disclosure led by individuals within the government. There's been tons of speculation about why it was him. Some people think that by making him the face of the project, that they had plausible deniability if the whole thing blew up and could easily throw him under the bus as just another delusional UFO kook. Others think that he's a useful idiot being used as the face of one of the largest-scale disinformation campaigns in our nation's history. But at least in my opinion, no explanation seems to fit quite as well as the one given by Tom himself. That he was chosen because he was the one who showed up, because he had some lucky breaks, because he pushed the envelope when others would have shied away, because he treated the topic and those involved with respect, but most importantly, because he came to them with a solution to a problem. And that right there is probably the biggest sticking point within the UFO community, that the pitch that seemingly got him in front of these high-ranking officials was one about helping the youth become less cynical about the military-industrial complex. We'll get more into the specifics of what Tom believes in just a sec, I swear. But suffice it to say that he sees the military-industrial complex as just one part of a necessary and even heroic international effort to respond to the biggest threat that our planet has ever faced. As the general said, it was the Cold War and they found a life form, and everything that they did after that, at least in this version of the story, was in order to protect the American people and allow them to live normal lives, while also moving heaven and earth to give them a fighting chance at fighting back against this potential enemy with technology far beyond our understanding. And that right there, for many in the UFO community and elsewhere, is a cardinal sin, taking the side of the military-industrial complex. I'll admit that, for me, it's a particularly hard pill to swallow. But could there be something to what DeLonge is saying? Or at the very least, something we can learn from it? And I think that there is. It's difficult to put yourself in the position of someone who at the end of World War II, the most horrible war our species has ever known, and in the early throes of the Cold War, with the threat of nuclear war looming large in the public consciousness, had to make the decision about whether or not to tell the American people and the world that we'd not only discovered an intelligent life form, but one with capabilities beyond our understanding. I might even argue that it's impossible to truly put yourself in their shoes. But after the events of the last few years, I think it's not too difficult to imagine what it was like to be just a private citizen during that time. The burning desire and the desperate need for stability after a time of crisis, for reassurance instead of despair, and the hope that life could one day be boring again. And we see that desire of the American people made manifest in the culture of the 50s. And from that perspective, you can at least make a case for why the powers that be may have chosen to keep this quiet. And then when things happened that they couldn't explain, like hypothetically a UFO crash in the desert, they had to tell a lie to cover it up, and then another, and another. Because that's the thing about lies. They tend to pile up. And when you break a rule once, it becomes easier and easier to justify doing it in the future. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. Could it be that the culture of secrecy that grew up around the UFO phenomenon was put in place to protect us? Perhaps. But it's hard to deny that even if the original intentions were good, that at some point along the way, things spun wildly out of control. Information about the phenomenon is jealously guarded by those at the highest levels of our government and stovepiped across different intelligence agencies, military branches, and even private corporations to an extreme that many question whether the president is even read into the most highly classified intelligence on UFOs, creating an illegal and undemocratic lack of oversight over something critical to our national security. But it's more than just that. The government has lied to the American people, launched disinformation campaigns that ruined the lives and livelihoods of countless experiencers, many of whom are members of our own military, and, if we're being honest, probably much, much worse. And on top of that, if the government has recovered exotic materials from UFO crashes, it seems likely that contracts would have been secretly awarded to select aerospace and defense companies, potentially giving them access to paradigm-breaking technology to the clear detriment of their competitors. And many people's response to all of this is basically, fuck those guys. They lied. They broke the law. They broke their oath of office to serve and protect the Constitution. The UFO files need to be unsealed, and those responsible for the cover-up need to be held accountable. And honestly, it's hard to find a flaw in that logic. The problem is that, faced with that sort of outcome, it seems unlikely that anyone who is in an actual position within the government to lead the charge on disclosure could be compelled to actually do so. They'd be effectively sending themselves and probably many of the people that they've known and worked with for years and even decades to the firing squad. And beyond just what they'd be doing to themselves, there's what that kind of revelation has the potential to do to our country. One can only imagine the endless court hearings and tribunals as they try to decide who owns what and who is responsible and for what and how much. How long would that drag out, and at what cost to our nation, both actual and spiritual? Who would sign up for that? Who would make that call? And if you did somehow work up the guts to do the right thing, would you know for sure that it was the right thing? I don't think it's that easy anymore. Too much time has passed. Too much has happened. But what I see in Tom's story is not just hope, but a way forward. Because when offered just the tiniest sliver of hope that there might be a way out of the lies and secrecy without burning everything to the ground in the process, look at how many people in powerful positions across the military-industrial complex answered that call. You don't need to believe what Tom DeLonge believes, or even to approve of his methods, to recognize that his approach is, more than likely, a big part of the reason that he's been so successful. And speaking of what Tom DeLonge believes, it's finally time to talk about it. But to be honest, it kind of freaks me out. Like, the makes me want to sleep with the light on kind of freaks me out. Award-winning investigative journalist and author of In Plain Sight, an investigation into UFOs and impossible science, Ross Coulthart, perfectly explained why in an interview on Theories of Everything with Kurt Jaimungal.
Have you heard of the proposition that the aliens are concerned with us starting a war rather than stopping a war? That they feed off of suffering?
Oh, God. Now you're getting really depressing. Please give me hope. I like to think of benevolent intelligence. I like to think that something that's vastly technologically superior to us and probably more intelligent than us has developed a moral values system that understands the importance of utilitarian ideas and moral decency and ethical values. Tom Delonge freaked me out. I spent a lot of time listening to Tom Delonge's interviews where he was talking about what he'd been told by the general and other people inside intelligence services before he went public with TTSA in 2016, 2017. And, I actually think it's really interesting because he talked about warring gods and jealous gods, and I thought it was crazy. And then the DNC leak happened, and it turned out that he really was talking. I mean, it's beyond doubt. People don't realize this. And again, it's just an amazing oversight by mainstream media that they haven't picked up on this. The leaked WikiLeaks emails, leaked by the Russian GRU, believe it or not, who hacked the Democratic National Committee, who tried to gain intelligence that might help Trump win against Hillary Clinton. The DNC emails show irrefutably that Tom DeLonge was telling the truth when he said that he was in communication with generals, General Neil McCasland, General Michael Carey, Robert Weiss of Skunk Works, Lockheed Martin, John Podesta, and other senior officers in Space Command, Central Intelligence Agency, and different sections of the US military were giving this punk rock star briefings, talking to him about what they knew. What I find fascinating is journalists look for evidence. You look for corroborative evidence. And so I'd listened to Tom, and like everybody else, I'd giggled. I thought, this guy's completely bananas. There was one particular coast-to-coast interview where I just thought he'd gone nuts. And then I remember feeling very humbled and quite ashamed of myself when I realized, oh my God, and I'm going through the DNC emails and going, hell's bells, if he was telling the truth about this, could it be he was telling the truth about the general when the general said, it was the Cold War and we found a life form? Could it be possibly true that the general did say that to him? And if he didn't, why would Tom lie about that?
I remember listening to this interview the first time and feeling this weird but overwhelming sense of relief to hear someone as well-respected and clear-thinking as Ross Coulthart say that Tom DeLonge freaked him out. Because I felt the same way. I, too, was starting to wonder if I was crazy. And it's not as simple as just, well, he said these crazy things that turned out to be true, so all these other crazy things he says must be true. A child can see through that logic. It would be extremely easy to dismiss any and everything that he said as delusional if that's all it was. The real sticking point is that the people with whom he has been in contact were the exact people who would have had real answers about the UFO phenomenon if there were any to be had. And these people not only briefed Tom on elements of the phenomenon, but several of them came out of the shadows for the first time at great personal cost to join him in his work with TTSA. Some of these people, including retired CIA officer Jim Semivan and physicist Hal Puthoff, still work directly with Tom. And although some of the founding members of TTSA have since moved on to pursue other disclosure efforts, and although they do tend to shy away from some of Tom's bolder claims when asked, they have never denounced him and seem to remain on friendly terms. And more importantly, they joined TTSA in 2017, at the time when Tom was giving his most unfiltered and shocking interviews. And they joined his organization and went on a media tour with him anyway, not departing the company until 3 years later. All of that seems highly unlikely if what Tom was saying about the nature of the phenomenon was simply the product of an unstable, paranoid mind. So this leaves us with only two options as far as I can see. Either one, at least some significant portion of what Tom DeLonge believes is more or less true, or this whole thing has been one enormous disinformation campaign meant to befuddle and confuse, to what end we really can't be sure. And listen, I know I've gotten very excited about this whole story, but that doesn't mean that I've entirely abandoned the possibility that this could all be a disinformation campaign. If only because, given the two possibilities that I just mentioned, it's the only one that doesn't break my brain and make me want to never sleep again. But I will say that if this has been a disinformation campaign, it's not been a very good one, because despite all of the press and interviews and the legislation and the television shows and the admissions from the Pentagon itself, how many people are really talking about this? Just doing the research for these two episodes took literal months to put together because it's scattered across the internet in podcast interviews, YouTube videos, books, rambling Reddit threads, and the occasional article from the real media that barely scratches the surface. Beyond a dedicated few in the UFO community, there's almost no one looking at the whole picture of this story and trying to figure out what the actual fuck is going on here. So, if this was it, if this was their big plan for some sort of massive disinformation campaign, then where is it? They had a multimillionaire rock star in the prime of his career with a growing media company at their full disposal. And they did what with that exactly? If you ask 10 people on the street who Lou Elizondo is, how many people do you think would know? Where I'm from, I'd say one on a good day. And what about all of these people in different parts of the government who've been working tirelessly for disclosure over the past 4 years since the New York Times article first dropped? Don't you think that they would have gotten further in getting the attention of the greater public if they actually had the full force of the United States government at their backs instead of in their faces actively trying to silence them? Because, to be clear, there are those within the government who are working against them. There have been well-documented efforts to subvert and sabotage the Gillibrand Amendment, legislation that first became law in December, calling for the creation of an independent office to investigate UFOs, for the first time with the direct oversight of Congress and a board of mostly civilian advisors. And Lou Elizondo has been the subject of particularly vicious threats and attacks, and the Inspector General has opened a case to investigate the illegal and mysterious deletion of all of his records and emails from his time at ATIP in a blatant attempt to discredit him. In short, I find basically everything that Tom DeLonge has said about the nature of the phenomenon to be very hard to believe. But I find it equally hard to believe, given the extraordinary and extraordinarily well-documented circumstances, that he's crazy or making it all up. So finally, what does Tom DeLonge actually believe? His views are as sweeping as they are bizarre, and I've done my best to collect them and put them into some sort of coherent narrative based on things he said in interviews and what was written in his books. This list is probably not entirely accurate, as his views may have changed over time, and they certainly aren't comprehensive. But here we go. Here is a peek into the universe according to Tom DeLonge. Let's start at the beginning. God is real, the summation of all the laws of physics and the source of consciousness. God is love. And the universe is teeming with intelligent life, some primitive and some more advanced than we can comprehend. Some flesh and blood, some inorganic, some artificial, and many with capabilities beyond our understanding. There are several different groups and species of entities that are particularly interested in Earth and in humans. Are UFOs extraterrestrial, ultra-terrestrial, interdimensional, temporal? In a word, yes. His advisors call them the others. One or more of these groups somehow meddled with the primates native to this planet to create humans. Were engineered in some way, perhaps even hybrids. But of what? We don't know why there is so much interest in humans. Maybe there's something different about us. Maybe we were never supposed to be made. Maybe we are possessions and they are guarding us like livestock. The others have been here since the beginning of human civilization, which itself is much older than we had ever imagined. There have been many cycles of history, each ending in calamity at the hands of the others. What we consider to be human history is just the most recent cycle. Atlantis was real, a great civilization that thrived because it had a way of defending itself against the others. The others eventually destroyed them for their hubris. To me, the single most shocking thing that Tom DeLonge has said is that in the beginning stages of meeting his advisors, that it was his pitch that got him in the door, but it was something else that seemed to be the key to these people taking him seriously. And that was the idea that the entire UFO phenomenon is about multiple gods with a little g that fight amongst themselves and, by design, factionalize mankind into different religions so that we fight each other. To what end, we don't know. It might be some kind of proxy war, it might be for entertainment, or, as DeLonge has often suggested, they might actually feed off of the energy of human suffering. During World War II, Melanesian islanders were exposed to modern technology for the first time, and despite the raging war, the vast amount of food, equipment, and medical supplies that were airdropped there significantly improved the lives of many of the islanders. As a result, some of the islanders began to worship the planes that would do these airdrops, thinking that they were sent from the gods. This phenomenon is called a cargo cult, and according to DeLonge, that's essentially what all of the major religions are: cargo cults. Virtually all of the ancient religions and traditions talk of the time when gods walked among us, or at least regularly made their presence felt. And that actually happened, but it wasn't gods walking among us, it was the others. Our government is aware of this. The Roswell crash was the first time that we got our hands on this advanced technology. This changed everything. Within 3 months of the Roswell crash, the Air Force was separated from the Army, the Department of Defense was created, and the CIA was created, all to investigate and potentially defend the country against this new threat. But this also allowed them to stovepipe information so that only a few people at the top had the full story. At nearly the same time, in both Russia and China, there were similar crashes. Tom says this was intentional. The others seemingly gave this technology to the 3 great world powers at the same time. Why? Tom has speculated that it could be to encourage more war, or it might just be to see which of us is strongest. The government hid what they knew from the public because they were also trying to hide what they knew from the others. They built bases and testing facilities deep underground and grimly, heroically got to work. The Cold War served as the perfect cover for decades of exorbitant spending and the stockpiling of advanced weaponry. The United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in an intense standoff, but the reason that the Cold War never got hot was because behind the scenes, they were working together against the others. To protect this secret, they launched a massive disinformation campaign, starting with Project Blue Book. With Project Mockingbird, they infiltrated the media to turn the narrative to make the subject of UFOs taboo, something that only kooks and conspiracy nuts would ever take seriously. They started the conspiracy theory that the moon landing was fake to distract from the truth, that the Apollo astronauts encountered UFOs and intelligently built structures on the moon. The others have bases on the moon, in our oceans, and even underground. Abductions and cattle mutilations are real, and these phenomena are closely tied to stories of demons. These entities are one and the same. There is at least one group of the others that hates humans, that would destroy us if they could. This may be because we have a soul, and therefore a direct link to the loving, eternal source that is God. Perhaps these beings don't have that. Perhaps advanced forms of AI don't have a soul. Or maybe it's more than just jealousy. There is something about the UFO phenomenon that is deeply tied to consciousness. Perhaps humans are much more powerful than we ever imagined. Perhaps we've forgotten who we are. And maybe there are beings who would do anything to prevent us from remembering. DeLonge says an advisor told him that there's a black pyramid underground in Alaska. They discovered it when anomalous measurements showed up during an earthquake. It's twice the size of the Pyramid of Giza, and they've been studying it for years. We've finally figured out what it is, his advisor told him. It's suppressing human consciousness. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. It's a lot. which is why it's frankly kind of distressing that so much of what Tom DeLonge has said has checked out, and that so many of his advisors not only have been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to be his advisors, but are the very people within our government who would know whatever secrets they may be hiding about the UFO phenomenon. I'm not saying that everything that Tom DeLonge is saying must be true, but at least some of it almost has to be. And any one of those things that I just told you would change everything. Taken as a whole, it makes me wonder if anything that I once believed about the nature of my reality is true. And that's the real takeaway here for me, that when it comes to the true nature of the UFO phenomenon, literally everything is on the table. And it's clear that, whatever the phenomenon is, the truth is sure to be stranger than fiction, and will undoubtedly challenge our ideas about who we are and what place we hold in the cosmos. So that's where we'll pick up next time, by beginning to follow some of these threads of possibility to see where they might lead us. And we'll begin this journey at the dawn of human civilization itself. Until next time.